The Treasure of the Magi, a study of modern Zoroastrianism. Book 1, Chapter 2, and James Hope Moulton's book. The Teachings of Zarathustra. And they said, "Who art thou?" He said, "I am a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord." Now, not Lord, Yahweh, increasing existence, God is a noun and a verb, establishing, but Lord, this is not a proper translation. Aduni, yeah, but Aduni is like leader of the community, so a lot of Adonais. And the Bible actually supports a lot of Adonais thing, but I'm getting distracted. I'm detracting from the main point. Zarathustra, whom the Romans called Zoroaster, following the Greeks, is one of the earliest of the goodly fellowship of the prophets, so far as their names are enrolled on earth. For history and genuineness of the archaic hymns, which tell us all we know about him, will not be discussed here. The flood of clever, stupid skepticism, which has long swept indiscriminately over all the great names of religious history, has begun to ebb, and common sense is getting its opportunity again. One conspicuous doctrine of common sense is that books must have authors, movements must have originators, effects must be presumed to have causes. And while it is obviously preferable from the standpoint of a candidate for a doctorate or a writer of the rationalist propaganda, who must at all costs be original, to do his bricklaying up in the air without a foundation, it is more likely to advance knowledge if we frankly adopt a less sensational procedure. All the information we possess about Zarathustra comes from the Gathas, 17 poems arranged in 5 groups according to their meters, and containing 900 lines in all. Their meters are much more elaborate than those of the later Avesta, and decidedly less comparable with the meters used in ancient Indian poetry. But the language is exceedingly archaic, differing only in phonetic development from the Vedic, with a minimum of new formations and considerable show of forms which stand nearer to the common Indo-Iranian parent speech than does Vedic itself. Now, there are definitely the beautiful, moving examples of the sound quality in the Sanskrit Vedic material, but the Avesta definitely stands out alone, saying it's not as refined and all this. It's like the understanding of it is not as refined. I'll give them that. The absolutely simple and natural picture of the prophet, drawn with convincing unconsciousness by his own hand, in the main, gives us its own credentials by the very impossibility of accounting for invention. Professor P.W. Schmeidel of Zurich, in a rare deviation into constructiveness, gives us a useful canon for historical criticism when he marked off what he called pillar passages, the reliability of which was guaranteed by their divergence from what the earliest age could have invented. The Gathas have plenty of pillars of this kind. An age in which a crude apotheosis has removed the prophet from reality would not have put into his mouth such words as these: "To what land shall I go to flee? Whither to flee? From the nobles and my peers. They sever me. Nor are the people pleased with me, nor the liar rulers of the land. How am I to please thee, Mazda Ahura? I know wherefore I am without success, because few cattle are mine, and for that I have but few folk. I cry unto thee, see thou to it, Ahura, granting me support as a friend gives to a friend. Teach me the right, the acquisition of good thought." Or again, would have made the ox soul our spirit of agriculture cry out, thus, on hearing that Zarathustra is appointed its champion. I must be content with the ineffectual word of an impotent man for my protector, when I wish for one that commands mightily. Whenever shall there be one who shall give him, the ox, effectual help? Or, once more, would have descended to the homely triviality of this picture from real life. The Cavi's wanton did not please Zarathustra Spitma at Wintergate, in that he stayed him from taking refuge with him, and when there came to him also his two steeds, shivering with cold. In contrast to all this, reality stands that the picture of the latter ages, which deviates from the dignity and probability more and more as time goes on. Now they're celebrating his birthday and all sorts of stuff. We are bound to ask what authority there is for even reasonably possible assertions about the prophet, for which there is no better witness than the latter Avesta, or the literature of the Sasanian age, which opened in the 3rd century of the Common Era. And you do see some things happening at that time, too, as far as changes to the tradition. The grotesque and barren miracles attested from these latter ages we reject on the mere reading of them, but any sound principle of historical criticism must surely bid us suspect profoundly statements about the prophet which cannot be traced beyond, say, 15 centuries from our own time. It is safe to restrict ourselves accordingly to the Gathas, the only Parsi literature, with one exception, which has any claim to come within several centuries of the prophet's time. That exception, the Gatha of 7 chapters, a little prose ritual in the archaic dialect of the verse Gathas, does not really concern us here, as there is only one mention of Zarathustra's name, and we can feel no certainty that it is not a gloss, since it is so isolated. If it is a genuine element, it is significant that we should read so early. Mazda and Zarathustra we adore. Yasna 42:21. We may proceed to draw from the Gathas the outlines of Zarathustra's personality, history, and teaching. The society in which he was born is well seen from the names of his associates. His own name and that of his disciple and father-in-law, Zarathustra, contain the word Ushtra, camel. His patron, Vishtaspa, and his son-in-law, Jamaspa, similarly, are named from Aspa, horse. The brothers, Zarathustra and Jamaspa, and their sister, whom the prophet married, have the clan name Havagva, having fine cattle, the only Gathic name whose significance takes us into another sphere is Puruchista, very thoughtful, which belongs to the prophet's daughter. Her nuptial ode on her marriage to Jamaspa is the last of the Gathas. She is the only person in the circle born after the prophet's preaching begins, and she alone has a name that has connotations of religion. This, of course, entirely in keeping with the truth of the situation. The names are alone a fatal bar against any mythological theory of the origins of the religion. In what social stratum did the prophet arise? It is not possible to be dogmatic, but the one thing that does seem to be reasonably certain is that he was not a magus. The burden of proof rests on those who would claim that the latter affirmative tradition is to be trusted. It is, of course, extremely easy to say how the claim was thought of. The Magi, as we shall see, came into a very close relation to the religion, and had the strongest motive for making the founder one of themselves. The Greek writers from the 5th century of the Common Era, the 5th century BCE, attest to this claim. But what does this amount to? It was in the 5th century that the Magi, after failing to win political power, gradually worked themselves into an indispensable position in religion. We can prove that it was only the Magian portrait of Zarathustra that the Greeks ever saw. The evidence then amounts to no more than this, that in the age when the Magi secured their place in the system of Persian religion, the founder of that religion was regarded as a magus. But however many centuries had passed since the prophet's own day, the language 1700 BCE to 2000 BCE of when this was written down, we gotta definitely at least put him in that period. If not, this is one of the old ones, even thousands of years before. The old sages, But how many centuries had passed since the prophet's own day? The question of the date of Zarathustra is one that must not be examined here. It must suffice to repeat the results of a detailed investigation in another place, and add that further consideration has strengthened the belief in a very early date, nothing later than the 10th century BCE, can be admitted. It would seem in another century or two might quite be reasonably allowed. If so, we have a gulf of at least 5 centuries between Zarathustra and our earliest Greek allusions to him. A priori, probably, would need to be very strong before we give much attention to such belated evidence. And since these same Greek writers solemnly set his Floriut at 6,000 years for Xerxes, we should be very inconsistent if we give weight to one half of the statements which no historian would dream of allowing to the other. Well, again, if this whole thing started in a Tarian age, was that the age of Taurus? 8,000 years ago? On the real significance of the period thus assigned to Zarathustra, I am afraid that some of my Parsi friends may think I am treating too cavalierly a doctrine many of them have seriously welcomed, though it flatly contrasts the Pahlavi literature. I am reminded of the danger of observing that Mr. Feridun Dadachanji, and there are few Parsis to whom I owe a greater debt, has gravely rebuked Western science for refusing to state, "We are only Joshuas, jealous for Moses' sake." Mr. Dadachanji's book was written in 1913, before I had the privilege of his friendship, and I hope by this time he realizes that the West does not determine hard facts of chronology by his prepositions. In his own chambers during office hours, he would make short work of one witness he produces, his brilliant brother, the late Mr. Kersasip. Page 124, I guess we're further on in this book, would have to treat all the Greeks as a horde of false witnesses. It is possible to smile at such a biased advocacy, and yet say that a date which throws all chronology into confusion is easily explained by a misunderstanding of Persian statements about the word millennia. Mr. Dadachanji believes that the prophets of Israel borrowed from Zarathustra. Dada's father, G, is like a title of respect. What's Chan mean? I was greatly disposed towards this view years ago, though to a more modest extent. I am afraid that there is very little left of this indebtedness when examined in dry light, the power of marshalling facts impartially and banishing the wish to behave is before all things the most crying need of Indian critical scholarship. I return to this borrowing question. This remains certain even if Professor Carnoy of Louvain we make it Aryazantava of noble birth instead of Aryazantava of Aryan birth. There are two possible answers to our question as to Zarathustra's social position. According to Herodotus, two of the 6 tribes of the Medes were the Arizantoi and the Magoi, which stand first and last in his list. The former are clearly the Aryan nobility. Now the Behestun inscription in one of its forms expressly calls Ahura Mazda god of the Aryans. Well, god of all, but all this talk about, oh, this is the god of this tribe and that tribe, it's like just because they speak a different language. He held this position a long time before Zarathustra's day, as we know from an Assyrian source. It is accordingly suggested that Zarathustra may have been born in the small clan of Aryan nobles, whose special divinity was the wise lord. Well, their favorite name of God, right? And instead of thinking there's like a group of gods and Ahura Mazda is just one, he's, there's names. God the loving, God the wise, God the. Other possibilities is that he belonged to the agricultural community, the religious value of whose occupation he preaches so strenuously. On the whole, the latter seems perhaps more probable, though